lesser evil kind, then even if they prevail, they'll betray our cause as they break God's laws, and liberty will fail. America began with humility, acknowledging God's plan. He said, if we seek His face, He will heal our land. I'm singing the American view. I'm bringing the American view. There is a God. He gave us our rights. He gave us civil government too. I'm playing the American view. I'm praying the American view. Historically traced, biblically based, it's the genuine American view. Bringing the American view. Yeah, I'm singing the American view. Bringing the American view. I'm playing the American view. Will you sing the American view? When our fathers pledged allegiance, it was not to a flag they saw. They declared our independence by bold reference to God's law. The American view was not so new back in 1773. It has roots that run back to Genesis 1 and all through history. So give me your ear if you care to hear the plan for liberty. It covers the span since time began, and it's true for you and me. A tyrannical king is a terrible thing our fathers had to face, but they declared with the faith they shared, law comes from a higher place. I'm singing the American view. I'm bringing the American view. There is a God. He gave us our rights. He gave us civil government too. I'm playing the American view. I'm praying the American view. Securing rights is what governments do in the genuine American view. There is a God, our rights come from Him. He is the author of the law. He created governments to secure those rights for us all. But when civil government gets all twisted and bent, the people have a duty to do. Abolish it and then rebuild it again in a way that is righteous and true. But how do we know what is righteous and true? Where is the beginning and the end? Is there a standard tried and true on which to depend? I'm singing the American view. socialist stuff, and you want to start. Let me do this. Let's start over. Good evening. And welcome to the Institute on Constitution. I welcome you all here who are here physically, and those of you who are somewhere else physically, but here virtually across the country. It's a privilege to be with you. I thank you very, very much. I always say it's a privilege to be with people who care about their country and their country's government. And tonight, we're in store for a treat. We're going to get a history lesson. And history, that's really a cool thing. History is a good thing. I once knew a professor of history who used the term like this. He said, history is like the mall map that gives contextual meaning to the little red arrow that says, you are here. Because we are all someplace, but unless we know our history, we don't know where we are really in history. And when we do know where we are in history, it very much helps us to know why we're here and what we're supposed to be doing here. So it's all a matter of adding context, and so we're going to get a history lesson tonight. And you may remember, some of you may remember that I once told you that I was raised Catholic, and then there was a time when I started hanging out with a bunch of Presbyterians, and it ended up kind of changing my life. And by the way, John Stormer has written a book that we have in the back called Something Was Missing. And in my situation, I'm somebody who comes from a Catholic family. My family is still very Catholic, and sometimes it causes conversations, at the Thanksgiving dinner table, et cetera, et cetera. And so John Stormer's book is a real aid in that, by the way. It's called Something Was Missing, and I think you might find it useful if that's your situation. I found it very useful. At any rate, when I was hanging out with those Presbyterians, an exchange happened between two men who were in the Bible study that made a mark on me, and I remembered it, and I want to share it with you. One of them had casually used the term prehistoric. He was talking about something, and he used the term prehistoric. And the other friend said, "Ken, what do you mean prehistoric? What did you say?" And he said, "Prehistoric. Why? What?" And he said, "What does that mean?" And he said, "Well, it's before recorded history." And he goes, "You're a Presbyterian." He goes, sitting in front of you, hold up your Bible. He was actually had one in his hand at the time. And he said, "Turn to page 1. And it says what? It says, "In the beginning," and it's recorded. So he said, "Ken, what happened before that? What's recorded before that?" So the point being that history, this not only is the, and I think we're going to get some evidence of this tonight from Wayne. This is not only the history book. It is a law book. It's the ultimate law book and the ultimate history book. And as we trace through the history of God's people and the history of liberty and ordered liberty, we're going to, I think, see the truth of that. So a word about my friend Wayne Smith. Wayne and I, we had this thing, we asked Wayne, "What title do you want us to introduce you by?" And he's, of course, a very humble person, and he didn't want any particular title. But I thought probably the greatest title that I can offer for Wayne is he's a graduate of the Institute on the Constitution. He actually is a model poster child for us because he did what I hope and I pray that people might do, and that is they come and they learn about law and liberty and freedom, and then there's this overriding desire to go, well, what do I do with this now? What do I do? And one of the things that you can do is you can run for civil office, and we try to inspire people to do exactly that. And as I say, Wayne is a poster child because this is actually mine, but I served with him on this Central Committee, the Republican Central Committee of the state of Maryland. This is signed by the governor and the Secretary of State. And I had the great privilege of serving with Wayne. He took the knowledge and the background that he learned here and the rest of the experiences in his life, and he gave back to the community by way of being elected to the Central Committee. And then in his last year, he was the chairman of the Central Committee. So I applaud him. He's my good friend, and I give you, for a history lesson, Wayne Smith. Oh, I forgot to pray. I'm going to, my mistake. I left out the prayer. Ron, can I ask you to stand, folks, and ask Mr. Ron Jones to lead us in prayer?
Heavenly Father, we just thank you for the ability to be here together in your name, Lord, and just thank you for allowing us to be in this country where we can worship you openly. And Lord, we just thank you for all the people here tonight, and just pray that you bestow your word, your law, and your wisdom on us all tonight as Wayne speaks through you, Lord. In Jesus' name.
Amen. Now, I also forgot one more thing. Please be seated, but there's a little trailer, Wayne, that we're going to play here, and then you begin right after that, okay?
Great, thank you.
Oh, you don't need this.
Okay. I have a mic.
All right, thank you. You are Mike. And I am Mike. I want to thank our sponsor, Access Ability, and for their generous contribution to make this evening possible.
Well, good evening, everybody. It's a privilege to be here tonight. Michael told you a little bit about my story. I did come to the Institute of the Constitution. There was a article in the Gazette about the Constitution being taught here back in 2005. I went to the classes, had a great time, and said, boy, I'd forgotten so much. And when I took the course, I said, well, somebody needs to do something about this. That's when you hear that still small voice saying, it's you. So, and so here I am tonight, 12 years later, really having a great time with what I've learned. Tonight, we're going to take a look at law, liberty, and the Bill of Rights, particularly the First Amendment with some other amendments. And this is mostly derived from the book, The Creation of the American Soul by John Barry. And it has a lot of other things in it, woven into it, that we'll talk about. Up here on our first slide, before I say that, this will be an interactive evening. I will tell you when it's time to be interactive, okay? Just to make sure we understand that. This is our First Amendment right up here on the screen. And you'll notice that it's written two ways. On the left is if you read it with Boolean logic, okay? Ors and ands and things like that. On the right is if you read it with the commas and the semicolons. The semicolons denoting a new string of thought. So as you read these, say, oh, that makes a bit of a difference as to what I'm thinking. And it's kind of a fun way of looking at it. Tonight, we will discuss how our Constitution is a convergence of multiple threads: legal, political, economic, theological, geographical, and technological. Who'd have guessed it had all that in it? The Declaration of Independence codifies the idea that God has granted each of us, by virtue of his creation, inalienable rights, rights that cannot be separated from the individual. These are distinct from civil rights. that are granted via membership in a civil organization such as the Rotary Club, a nation state, etc. Governments are established, and particularly with the wording used in our founders' documents, to secure those rights, not to grant them. Our rights actually come from God. Any government that does not secure those rights violates God's granting of them and should be abolished. So, prelude to the political thread, I'm going to take us back to the 15th century in merry old England, where you have the War of the Roses. This was quite before the movie, which has nothing to do with Lancaster versus York, but it's an English civil war for control of the throne. And eventually the wars eliminated the direct male lines of both families. This is the interactive part. What problems do you think that created? Direct males are eliminated.
No heir to the throne.
No heir to the throne. Well, what problem does that create? Nobody in charge. Everybody wants to be in charge. Maybe even a foreign power coming in an invasion. It's very threatening to the nobility and to the people when there is not a smooth succession of power. And we see that over and over, not only in medieval times, but in our own times. Edward IV was the first Yorkist king of England from 1461 to 1483. And his brother, Richard III, the last of the Plantagenets, was defeated and killed at the Battle of Bosworth. And he was killed by Henry Tudor, who was nephew of Henry VI. By virtue of this victory, Henry Tudor becomes the King of England. He becomes Henry VII, suggesting what? The bloodline. That is correct. He marries Elizabeth of York. He cements the bloodlines with the York family, and their sons include Henry VIII. And the House of Tudor ruled England until 1603, when Elizabeth passed away. And she, of course, was the granddaughter of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. Now the technological thread starts to begin, along with the theological thread. In 1384, a century before, John Wycliffe finishes the first translation of the Bible into English from the Latin Vulgate. His version and copies of it are handwritten, and more than 250 manuscripts survive. In 1408, the Synod of Oxford tries to suppress the Wycliffe Bible with little success, and then just after that, we start to get the printing press coming into view. Gutenberg's work on the printing press starts, and that changes everything. The printed word allows common people to become educated, and then they become knowledgeable. And with knowledge comes power. Okay? Bibles were the first printed books available to the common people. Now in 1525, Tyndale is following in Wycliffe's footsteps. This is the first printed English New Testament, and it's the basis of all future works of the Bible. 90% of the New Testament in the King James Version is Tyndale's translation. And by the same token, where the King James Version departs from Tyndale's wording, the English Revised Version of 1881 went back to it. Unfortunately, in 1536, Tyndale was executed for heresy before he could complete his Old Testament translation. It's very challenging to do something new and controversial. Well, now the political and theological threads start to merge. Henry VIII needs a male heir to carry on the Tudor line and provide that smooth transition of power, which is why he wanted a divorce from Catherine of Aragon, because they had not had a male child. So he started pursuing Anne Boleyn, and he broke with the Catholic Church because he was not granted a divorce to marry Anne Boleyn. And then with the Acts of Supremacy in 1534, Parliament recognized the king's status as the only supreme head in earth of the Church of England. And the Treasons Act of 1534 made it high treason, punishable by death, to refuse the oath of supremacy, acknowledging the king as such. All adults in the kingdom were required to acknowledge those acts' provisions, declaring Henry's marriage to Anne legitimate and his marriage to Catherine illegitimate by oath. It's that time again. What problems do you think that caused? If you disagreed with Henry's interpretation of theology, it meant that you disagreed with him as the King of England and were subject to treason. That meant that you could be executed by being drawn and quartered. Okay? And so this was a definite issue in combining the power of the church over the power of the state in a single individual. And they were trying times to be English. Catherine of Aragon dies in January of 36. Anne is executed in May, and then opposition occurs by October. The northern part of England revolts, and then 2 years later, Henry is excommunicated by Pope Paul III because he is unrepentant. He passes away in 1547, leaving his son Edward VI on the throne. And this is where you get the story of the Prince and the Pauper. This is Edward the Sixth, who is the boy in that particular story by Mark Twain. Well, unfortunately, he dies in 1553 at the age of 16, leaving no male heir. But his sister Mary, the daughter of Henry and Catherine, becomes queen. She is known as Bloody Mary because she tries to reverse the English Reformation, and she executes 300 Protestants, leading to John Fox's The Book of Martyrs. She is succeeded by her sister Elizabeth, who brings stability to England for 44 years. You know, this is unusual in a time of rapid turnover, but we have a very stable government in England at this time. Then once again, peaceful transition of power is crucial for the subjects of the crown. Note that what these people are called, they are called subjects of the crown. Does anybody recognize that mask in the upper right? That's a Guy Fawkes. You might also see it used today in various places. So by 1559, the Act of Uniformity makes attendance in church and the use of the Book of Common Prayer compulsory. So now you must attend church and you must use this book. Okay? That's the way it is. 1588, we all know about the Spanish Armada, but perhaps we forget that Philip II was Mary Tudor's husband. Okay? And he attacks England but fails to conquer it. In 1603, Elizabeth dies, and James I of Scotland becomes King of England. Now, his father had been Catholic and was murdered, and his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, had been beheaded because of her aspirations to the throne of England against Elizabeth. In 1605, English Catholics placed 1,800 pounds of gunpowder beneath Westminster Palace to kill the king and Parliament. And for participating in the gunpowder plot, its traitors were drawn and quartered. Does anybody know what this is celebrated every year at? Is known as? Yes, England does have a 4th of July. I do want to let you know that, but not ours. I heard it. Guy Fawkes Day. Okay, celebrated every year. By the way, if you one of the books that has this as a major part of the plot is Column of Fire. If you've not read that, with the Kingsbury sequence by, help me out here, I'm having a senior moment, historical writer Ken Follett. Okay, Follett's Column of Fire goes into this quite well. Well, what Bible are they using during all this turmoil? Because that's an important thing. We need an English Bible. So in 1538, the clergy was directed to provide one book of the Bible of the largest volume in English, and the same set up in some convenient place within the church that you have care of, whereas your parishioners may most commodiously resort to the same and read it. Henry wanted the Bible to be available to the common people. And the Great Bible of 1539 was the first authorized edition of the Bible in English, first authorized. And the Great Bible, of course, included much from Tyndale, who had done all that translation work. It's also known as the chained Bible because it was chained to the altar, because it was very valuable and they didn't want people walking off with it. This led to the Geneva Bible of 1560, and here we have our theological and technological threads merging. This is the first translation of the Bible based entirely on the original Hebrew and Greek. Remember, previously it was based on translating the Latin Vulgate into English. It's the primary Bible of 16th century Protestantism, and it's one of the Bibles taken to America on the Mayflower. It's the Bible used by Shakespeare, Oliver Cromwell, John Knox, John Donne, and John Bunyan. For the very first time, a mechanically printed, mass-produced Bible was made available directly to the general public. You could print 200 Bibles in the time it took to manually copy one Bible. This was a great, great improvement to getting out the Word of God. The first study Bible included study guides, cross-references, introductions, and summaries of each book of the Bible, maps, tables, woodcut illustrations, and indices. Now, King James did not like the Geneva Bible, who referred to a king as a tyrant and included marginal notes that offended him, hence the King James Version that's coming next. And here's an enlargement of it. I mean, that is, part of the woodcut in there. To me, when you think about the technology available, this is a beautifully illustrated book. Well, the King James Bible is the most influential version of the most influential book of the world. It was translated by 47 Church of England scholars. The New Testament was translated from Greek. They went back to it. The Old Testament was translated from the Hebrew text, while the Apocrypha was translated from both Greek and Latin. And this was the book that taught reading to everyone and provided a common cultural foundation. That is an extremely important point, because when we get to America, what is our common foundation and why is it? What's part of it? And we need to have that discussion. So let me ask you a question. Is money the root of all evil? Oh, I was hoping somebody said it would. I was going to ask you to give me your wallet and I can help you out with that. But unfortunately, you know that it's the love of money is the root of all evil. James on the throne made his subjects uneasy. Would they return to the purges and martyrdom of Bloody Mary, his mother? Religion, economic issues, political deadlock, and personal issues with King James' morals led to uneasiness throughout England. The government had been underfunded for at least a century. Does that sound familiar? Things do not change. Henry VIII financed the government by ransacking the Catholic Church. Elizabeth balanced her income and expenses at £300,000 a year, but she did that mostly at the expense of her lords. They were the ones that paid for the shot and the gunpowder and the ships that fought the Spanish. It wasn't the Queen. James' expenses exceeded £500,000 without a war being fought. Twice he summoned Parliament for money and was twice dissolved without a solution, because Parliament had to grant the king the money. And he blamed this on the Puritan members infringing on his divine right. Does anybody remember what the divine right of kings is? Any guesses? The king is the law. He can do anything he wants. There are no limits on the king, because he obviously was appointed by God and therefore can do anything he wants. So this was a divine right of kings, and he believed that. And what led to this, the rule of law leads to this. So now we talk about the legal thread reappearing. Roman law or civil law favored an absolute monarch, but it had less impact on isolated England than the continent. The Celts also had their courts of the forest. They were used to their different tribes getting together and making decisions on issues that were brought to them. They did not take it to the Romans. The Charter of Liberties was a written proclamation of Henry I, binding the king to certain treatment of nobles, church officials, and individuals. 1100 AD. Why do you think Henry I did this? And the hint is 1066. England was conquered in 1066. Henry is a Norman. He is a foreign king. How can he bring peace to a land? By trying to convince his subjects that they were all the same, and they all, particularly the nobility, they all operated under the same set of rules. So he was bringing standards to England, saying, this is what we're going to do. I'm responsible for following this. You are responsible for following this. We're all in the same boat. This is very novel, the first time anything like this is had, because what this does do is speak against the divine right. The king is saying, I have some limitations. Very different concept here. The Charter of Liberties was generally ignored by monarchs, as you can imagine, and in 1213, Archbishop Langton reminded the nobles that their liberties had been guaranteed over a century prior in Henry I's Charter of Liberties. Who were these nobles? By the way, there's a quote up there. No man shall be seized or imprisoned except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. That is in the Magna Carta. It leads to the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta was forced on King John in 1215 and was based on the Charter of Liberties, forcing the kings to swear at their coronation to keep the laws and righteous customs of England. The king must keep the laws and customs. That is what he's swearing to do. This is very important to remember, because we're going to come back to this. It has significant consequences. By 1200, Henry III sent itinerant justices across England to make the law common and consistent. There were standards. Imagine that, standards. This is the standard. This is what we expect. Crime was no longer between a perpetrator and a victim, but it violated the king's peace and was against the nation, leading to crime now being against the state. The reason they did that is it eliminates vendettas between individuals. It's not two families, the Hatfields and McCoys. It is the state stepping in and saying, you have committed a crime against the state. And therefore, that is why it's done that way. It eliminates that vendetta issue. The spread of common law created a web that restrained power and grounded in property rights and protected against arbitrary abuse of power. Well, the crown rests heavy on the king's head. This is unique to England. It is not in other countries. It imposed these concrete limits and also contradicted the divine right of kings. James had sworn to confirm and sustain them, but was influenced by what he saw elsewhere on the continent and his own desires. So he really wanted to go off the ranch. Here we meet Sir Edward Coke. He was an English barrister, judge, and politician who was considered to be the greatest jurist of the Elizabethan and Jacobean eras. It's to him that is the quote, the home to everyone is to him his castle and fortress, as well for his defense against injury and violence as for his repose. It was not Russell Crowe in Robin Hood. As Attorney General, he led the prosecution in the gunpowder plot conspirators. As Chief Justice, he then later declared the king to be subject to the law and the laws of Parliament to be void if in violation of common right and reason. We could do an entire 2-hour session just on saying, is a law right? A law is not right if it violates common rights and reasons. And I know that this has come up in the course in the Constitution. These actions eventually led to his transfer to the Chief Justiceship of the King's Bench, where it felt he could do less damage. Why was that? The king was the executive branch. Parliament was the legislative branch. Being on the king's bench meant that he was under the ostensible control of the king. So the king was trying to control him. Well, that didn't work out that well. He was dismissed from the bench in 1616 because he caused too much trouble, and he returned to Parliament, where he swiftly becomes a leading member of the opposition. Coke was instrumental in the passage of the Petition of Right, a document considered one of the 3 crucial constitutional documents of England, along with the Magna Carta of 1215 and the Bill of Rights, which follows later in 1689. Passed in 1628, the petition contains restrictions on non-parliamentary taxation, forced billeting of soldiers. Does that sound familiar? Imprisonment without cause. Sound familiar? And the use of martial law. Roger Williams became Coke's apprentice in his teens, and the exact dates are unknown of that. Williams becomes a Puritan minister, a theologian, and the author who founded the colony of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. Williams was a staunch advocate for religious freedom, separation of church and state, and fair dealings with the American Indians, and he was one of the first abolitionists. Now our economic, political, and theological threads have merged. James was pursuing a marriage of his son, the future King Charles I, to Maria Anna of Spain, granddaughter of Philip of the Armada fame. Who in England didn't remember the reign of Bloody Mary, the burning of Protestants? For those that didn't, every Protestant church had a copy of the Book of Martyrs. Make sure you read this to remember what things were like. Only King James seemed to forget the gunpowder plot, which was designed to kill him. Increased commercial competition from Holland led to poverty and disillusionment and gave a pretext for war by James, which required money. There was no deficit spending in those days. Money meant metal, not paper. You had to have the actual coin to give to somebody to go to war to pay for your warfare. James was in his usual frantic search for money. Remember, he spent 2/3 more than Elizabeth had, and was selling off the crown lands. He was selling peerages. Oh, you'd like to become a knight? We can do that. Today we have a deal for you. It used to be £1,000. Today it's only 200. There were a lot of knights in England at that time. He was granting monopolies. The one on ale was particularly onerous. Who wouldn't want to have the monopoly on ale? That would be a great way to get very rich. Now the geographic thread emerges because we have the Americas. In 1620, separatists sailed from Southampton, having lived in Holland, to create a city of God. This is another audience participation time. Why might they leave Holland, and why might the Dutch want them to leave? Who did King James want to go to war with? Holland. They were the ones that were in the economic forefront of technology right now. And so therefore, if you were English living in Holland, your neighbors may not be kind to you because they might think of you as a fifth columnist. So you as an Englishman might want to leave Holland, and the Dutch might be eager to have you gone because they were concerned about their own country. So they have sailed off to Massachusetts. At the same time that is occurring, Koch is using his position, knowledge, and clout to convict and impeach influential members of James's inner circle. Attorney General Henry Yelverton. I particularly like Giles Mompesson. Now here is a man who knew how to really get rich quick. First, he had the monopolies on taverns. Oh, think there's any money to be made there? How about he had the monopoly on the creation of silver and gold thread? Oh, that's a good thing. And finally, he was allowed to settle the disputes as to whether or not the land, because remember, a lot of the land belonged to the king, whether this particular plot of land belonged to the king or whether it belonged to somebody else. And if the plot of land happened to be worth less than 200 pounds, then Mompesson could keep it. What do you think that led to? He became a wealthy landowner, okay? So, but who Koch was really aiming at was Sir Francis Bacon, who was the second highest rank in the realm after the king. Bacon was forced to admit his guilt of corruption, fined $40,000, and banned from public office. Now, King James did come along and pay the fine, granted him a full pardon. Some things don't change. He could not prevent the impeachment because he needed Parliament to grant him money. That's the only way he could get money, is having Parliament grant it. He was embarrassed over the removal of his most able lieutenant, but he didn't adjourn Parliament because he needed the money. When Parliament reconvened, it promptly demanded enforcement of anti-Catholic laws because of their concern over their historical memory. And they said, "We beg our most noble prince may be timely and happily married to one of our own religion." And they offered taxes for home use only. No wars, not enough money for that. We only give you enough to spend at home. James refused to read or answer the petition, saying the issues such as matters of state or marriage were above your reach and capacity, and discussions breached royal prerogative, which was probably true. But he also further warned himself and started getting himself in trouble here. We think ourselves very free and able to punish any man's misdemeanors in Parliament, which we mean not to spare hereafter upon any man's insolent behavior there. Now, if you were in Parliament and this was read to you as coming from the king, how would you feel? A bit threatened, maybe? Okay. So we are starting to see the split between the monarchy and the Parliament here in England. Coke informed his colleagues there was no legal precedent, and I added the word legal, for the king's message, and they defiantly passed a second, almost identical petition. And in response, James dissolved Parliament and sent Coke to the Tower of London for 6 months. I did a Google search for Coke and the Tower of London because I wanted to get a wood carving or something of Coke sitting in the Tower of London. Unfortunately, the only thing that came up was this particular image of the 2012 Olympics in London. By 1625, James dies. He had only been in office for 22 years, only half the time of Elizabeth. But his son Charles I, has the same belief in the divine right of kings. He marries Henrietta Maria of France, a Catholic, and secretly agrees to relax enforcement of anti-Catholic laws. In France, Spain, and Germany, the monarchs have begun consolidating the power, and they're ignoring their parliaments, touching off fears in England of, will this happen here? Parliament attempted to limit Charles' activities by only authorizing funds for a year. Why do you think that is?
Limited spending.
Keep it in budget.
You might keep him in budget. Does it work for us? No. Yeah. But then we're not dealing with metal, we're dealing with paper. But why might you also, if you can only get funds for a year, what must you do? You have to go back and ask for more. It's a way of maintaining assurance that they continue to be called up and have a voice in the kingdom. Without the funds, martial law was imposed in local areas requiring residents to billet soldiers and sailors with only a promise of future payment, violating every man's home as his castle. Does that sound familiar with any of the Bill of Rights? The knights, the local leaders, and the members of Parliament were imprisoned when they refused to loan the crown voluntary gifts. Okay? Oh, you will help the king, won't you? No, I won't. Off you went. So by 1628, Charles was broke. He was forced to release those in prison. He had to call another parliament. And of course, who was elected to the parliament were the refusers, not the people that had supported the king. Coke, serving in his last parliament, convinced Commons that the king was not above the law. He convinced lords that rights were like land and jewels, concrete items of intrinsic value. Like property, rights could not be taken without due process of law. And so the petition of right was unanimously passed by Commons and Lords that defined the right of the subjects, Parliament, and the limitation on royal prerogatives, all going back to the Magna Carta, going back to the civil liberties. So this stretched back at this point, 800 years, 700 years or so. So this is a very English thing and unusual for England. Did not happen in the rest of Europe. Now, Charles, in the meantime, managed to figure out, how can I find out what's going on? I'll create a network of people to tell me what's going on. So he supported those ministers who preached the Puritans were enemies of the monarchs. Parliament returns in 1629 without Coke, and Williams, remember Roger Williams? He was a Protestant minister. He was that protege of Coke. He now becomes the messenger between Parliament and leading families because of his relationship with Coke, and he becomes a private chaplain. He witnessed and wrote of Common's last act when the king's soldiers tried to storm the chamber to prevent their passing. Anyone who cooperated with the king was a capital enemy, a traitor subject to death. These are serious words. These lead to all sorts of issues in England, and it leads to a new world. The Puritans could see a rise in Catholic worship and a decline in their rights. Spies reported about their worship. Superior Dutch technology and textiles had ruined the economy, and poverty was spreading. The Puritans in England were being persecuted by William Laud, Archbishop of Canterbury. Laud defined offenses against the church as treason, prevented more Puritans from migrating, and intended to even pursue those who fled to America, including military assault to seize their charter. By 1629, Williams was being offered a post in the New World by the Massachusetts Bay Company. At the same time, Charles was demanding the names of all the private chaplains to investigate and purge them. What was Williams? A private chaplain. If you were Williams, what would you do? Take the offer. I'm off to the New World. Sounds like a great idea. 1631, he arrives in Massachusetts, and the church leaders offers him the post of minister. He is so grateful that he becomes a persona non grata by rebuffing their practices because he doesn't like the way they worship, and he rejects their offer. How do you think they now felt about him? Yeah, that did not go over well. Now, the Bay Area magistrates also prevented him then from becoming a pastor at Salem, an issue of members of the state involving themselves in church matters. Despite prohibiting a church officer from simultaneously holding a government job, it didn't prohibit interference in the opposite direction. By October 1635, the Massachusetts General Court tries Williams and convicts him of sedition and heresy, and he fled to what becomes Providence, Rhode Island. Williams creates a settlement there. It's for those who are distressed of conscience, and it soon attracts a collection of dissenters and otherwise minded individuals. In my own family, as related, my wife is looking through Ancestry.com. She finds her ancestors are coming over, and then the exact same people come over to America 10 years later. Says, what's going on here? Well, the first time they came over, they came to Massachusetts. They felt a lot like Williams did. They didn't like it, so they went back to Holland. The next time they came over, they came back to Rhode Island. So it's just, if you do the ancestry stuff to find out where your ancestors are, there's some interesting things that you can find out that tie all this in a very personal way. Now, we have a new idea now. We are going to have a majority vote of the heads of households govern our new settlement in civil things only. It has nothing to do with religious things. It's the first place in modern history where citizenship and religion are separate, providing religious liberty. You can practice the way you want to worship, and this separation of church and state. Williams goes back to England to secure his charter from a Puritan parliament for Providence plantations. That takes a lot to say. In July of 1644. He described the attempt to compel belief as rape of the soul and spoke of the oceans of blood shed as a result of trying to command conformity. Remember what everybody had to do with the Book of Common Prayer? You also had to attend services. That was compulsory. He said that while the scriptures ought to inform the civil magistrate, he observed that well-ordered, just, and civil governments existed even where Christianity was not present. Thus, all governments had to maintain civil order and justice, but Williams decided that none had a warrant to promote or repress any religion. Meanwhile, back in England, things are really getting dicey. The Long of Parliament assembles in November of 1640 and quickly begins proceedings to impeach the king's leading counselors of high treason. They are using the rule of law, which the kings had agreed to since the civil liberties, magnified in the Magna Carta, and now being applied to everybody. As a result, Thomas Wentworth is beheaded. Archbishop Laud, beheaded. And John Finch, seeing where things are going, flees to Holland. So at this point, Parliament passes the Triennial Act. Now that requires Parliament to be summoned at least once every 3 years because they were tired of not being summoned by the king. And it could be summoned by the Lord Keeper and 12 peers if the king failed to do so. They now had an alternative way of being called. They could call themselves into power if the king did not do that. Charles was forced to sign it because it was coupled with a subsidy bill. Does that sound familiar? These are not new techniques that we hear in the paper and on the news every night. In 1642, Charles invades Parliament's chamber to arrest 5 members of the Commons on grounds of treason. This is a grave breach of parliamentary privilege, and this leads to outright war. Parliament seizes London and southeast England and the English Navy, while Charles's forces control roughly the Midlands, Wales, and West County and northern England. The war continues indecisively over the next couple of years until Parliament won major battles, particularly under the command of Oliver Cromwell. Excellent movie in the early 1970s on that, by the way. January of 49, Charles is accused of treason against England by using his power to pursue his personal interests rather than the good of the country. Charles claimed that the court had no jurisdiction over a monarch, that his own authority to rule had been given to him by God and by the traditional laws of England, and that the power wielded by those trying him was only that of force of arms, and the trial was illegal. The court challenged the doctrine of sovereign immunity and said the King of England was not a person, but an office whose every occupant was entrusted with unlimited power to govern by and according to the laws of the land and not otherwise. The king is condemned to death and sentenced and beheaded on January 30th, 1649. With this stroke, literally, England becomes a republican commonwealth, now said to be a constitutional monarchy or a limited monarchy. Cromwell became Lord Protector until 1659, and then Charles's son becomes king again in 1660. One of the things that ties this all together, I went and saw my friend Tom, who's sitting back there in the corner. He was the lead in the play The Crucible by Miller. And The Crucible really, made during the time of McCarthyism, really points this out well. Here is somebody tried and condemned to death tried for witchcraft by civil government. This is exactly what everybody was trying to say. That's not the role of government. You need to separate those two things. And I thought, when I saw that play and I read this book, I said, I need to put some other threads here together to talk about how did all this come about? How did we end up with our rights in the Constitution? Because so many things come together. So all of these threads now fall into place. The First Amendment reflects that neither kings, Henry, James, Charles, whoever, nor elected leaders, like the ones at Massachusetts that tried Williams for heresy and sedition, have authority over church matters. That when they do, objections based on a solely religious basis were used to try people for crimes against the government for treason. And that is definitely not who we are as Americans. Therefore, the United States government will not have any authority over religion. The Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, reflects the founders' history of the English Civil War and the need to defend yourself against the king. And it also reflects the founders' and the experience in Revolution of the need to defend yourself against the king, because you did not know when the king was going to come and try to take what you had. The Third Amendment reflects the housing of soldiers, the use of common people to house soldiers and sailors without compensation. This was something that was that happened prior to the Revolution right here in the States and led to that Third Amendment. And finally, the Eighth Amendment reflected and was derived from the English Bill of Rights of 1689. Drawing and quartering were used to punish treason. It was misused against violators objecting to worship styles or doctrine because the king, as head of the church, was also the ruler. Therefore, objections in church matters was treason. This was one of the cruel and unusual forms of punishment from which we are protected. And I won't go into what drawing and quartering is, but it is a particularly brutal means of death. This brings us to the end of the presentation I have for us tonight, 2,000 years of history in roughly 40 minutes. Giving us time now to take a breath and ask What questions might you have? What observations might you have? And Michael looks like he wants to say something.
First thing I want to say is thank you, Wayne.
You're welcome.
And then the next thing I want to suggest is maybe we could collect our thoughts and our questions and take maybe a 10-minute break, and we'll have a word from our sponsors, and come back and regather up and ask. We'll ask Wayne to flesh out the other 600 years. Thank you very much. Excellent presentation. Thank you very,
You're
very
welcome.
much for
Thank
your
you so much
scholarship.
for the
We appreciate it
opportunity.
very much. And we'll be back in 10 minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm singing the American view. I'm bringing the American view. There is a God, He gave us our rights. He gave us civil government too. I'm playing the American view. I'm praying the American view. Securing rights is what governments do in the genuine American view. There is a God, our rights come from Him. He is the author of the law. He created governments to secure those rights for us all. But when civil government gets all twisted and bent, the people have a duty to do. Abolish it and then rebuild it again in a way that is righteous and true. But how do we know what is righteous and true? Where is the beginning and the end? Is there a standard tried and true on which to depend? I'm singing the American view. I'm bringing the American view. There is a God, He gave us our rights. He gave us civil government too. I'm playing the American view. I'm praying the American view. Securing rights is what governments do in the genuine American view. Well, you've had enough of socialist stuff and you want to start pitching the tea. You can throw the bums out, but you better watch out for alternative tyranny. For if the leaders we find are the lesser evil kind, then even if they prevail, they'll betray our cause as they break God's laws, and liberty will fail. America began with humility, acknowledging God's plan. He said, if we seek His face, He will heal our land. I'm singing the American view. I'm bringing the American view. There is a God, He gave us our rights. He gave us civil government too. I'm playing the American view. I'm praying the American view. Historically traced, biblically based, it's the genuine American view. Bringing the American view. Yeah, I'm singing the American view. Bringing the American view. I'm playing the American view. Will you sing the American view? pledged allegiance, it was not to a flag they saw. They declared our independence by bold reverence to God's law. The American view was not so new back in 1773. It has roots that run back to Genesis 1 and all through history. So give me your ear if you care to hear the plan for liberty. It covers the span since time began, and it's true for you and me. A tyrannical king is a terrible thing our fathers had to face, but they declared with the faith they shared, law comes from a higher place. I'm singing the American view, I'm bringing the American view. There is a God, He gave us our rights, He gave us civil government too. I'm playing the American view, I'm praying the American view. Securing rights is what governments do in the genuine American view. There is a God, our rights come from Him. He is the author of the law. He created governments to secure those rights for us all. But when civil government gets all twisted and bent, the people have a duty to do. Abolish it and then rebuild it again in a way that is righteous and true. But how do we know what is righteous and true? Where is the beginning and the end? Is there a standard tried and true on which to depend? I'm singing the American view, I'm bringing the American view. There is a God, He gave us our rights, He gave us civil government too. I'm playing the American view, I'm praying the American view. Securing rights is what governments do in the genuine American view. Well, you've had enough of socialist stuff and you want to start pitching tea. You can throw the bums out, but you better watch out for alternative tyranny. For if the leaders we find are the lesser evil kind, then even if they prevail, they'll betray our cause as they break God's laws, and liberty will fail. America began with humility, acknowledging God's plan. He said, if we seek His face, He will heal our land. I'm singing the American view, I'm bringing the American view. There is a God, He gave us our rights, He gave us civil government too. I'm playing the American view, I'm praying the American view. Historic. Jones, would you ask him if to give me a nod when he wants me to start again? The sign still says on air, but I don't think we are. Can I ask you to let's gather back up, please, and 5, 4, 3, 2. Hello again. Let me just make a quick announcement. There have been a number of people who have asked for a copy of the slides that Wayne has, and we're we're actually trying to print a couple right now of his slides, but the printer isn't listening at the moment. That happens sometime. But at any rate, if you'd like to get them electronically, Wayne is happy to share them. And just please give your email to Teresa and tell her that's what you'd like, and we will make sure that you get the slides electronically. That way, you can know what Wayne knows. Anyway, I want to ask you to join me in thanking Wayne again for the presentation. Thank you. Thank you very much. We appreciate your scholarship and your diligence, and the fact that you're a nice guy. I just call him Mr. Chairman. That's how I refer to him, Mr. Chairman. So I'm going to leave it to Wayne right now to handle questions. I actually wanted to take a privilege and ask the first question if I could, Wayne, but I need my book back here to do that. So you stay right there, and let me sneak back here. Yeah, no, you go up to the podium.
Just want to make sure I had that right. And is my mic on?
When I said stay here, I meant just generally here. I didn't mean specifically here. One of the things that I appreciated, Wayne, was the developing idea that went against the right of kings, the divine right of kings, and the separation of function that it's kind of stumbling in a way. We realized it was necessary, and it kind of goes back to a biblical principle, which is that man has a fallen nature, and so we have to separate, and we have to separate power. We can't let any one man become overly powerful. We have to separate that, and that's a recognition of the way God created the world. There's a quote by Reverend John Cotton. I'd just like you to comment on this, and it says this. We use this in the course in our Institute on the Constitution basic course. Cotton, who was a Puritan preacher, said, "Let all the world learn to give to mortal men no greater power than they are content they shall use. For use it, they will. And unless they be better taught of God, they will use it ever and anon, for whatever transcended power is given will certainly overrun those who give it and those who receive it." So I'm actually reminding myself here now of the Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings, where the power in any one man is violative of the way God made the world.
So that does lead me to a joke, if that's okay. Four professionals were discussing what's the oldest profession. And the farmer said, well, obviously it's farming because, we put down roots, grew grain, and we're able to feed our families. And the doctor said, no, it was definitely surgery because God took Adam, removed a rib, and created Eve. And the engineer said, oh, no, before that, God took chaos and created order. And the lawyer said, where do you think the chaos came from? So one of the things that we have, the privilege in this country that the others do not, and we discussed this a little bit, in England you are still a subject of a queen. Here we are a citizen with full rights. And we do have, anybody who has raised kids, has anybody ever had to teach a 2-year-old to lie? Where do they learn that from? Oh yeah, and possessive, it's all mine, okay? The words they first learn after mom and dad are no and mine. And so we have a nature that really is saying, hey, we're kind of self-centered. And in terms of living in a peaceful and a harmonious community, what do we have to do? How do we prevent a charismatic, powerful person from being absolute ruler and taking everything that we have? And so we have this separation of powers with the federal government with 3 branches, and we have the separation between the state and federal government, and we have boundaries within each one that are very important. Have you ever played a game with somebody who didn't respect the boundaries? When they passed go, they took $300 instead of $200. It's playing the game within the boundaries that makes it fun for all of us. And it's the same way of living in life. We have to stay within the boundaries. And when people are outside the boundaries, we have to say, you're outside the boundaries and you need to get back inside them. And yet that has become very difficult for us today, I think.
Just as a benefit for the people who are watching, if you have a question, I'm going to just give the microphone and please pass it around. And Wayne, please try to make sure that people are using the mic when they're
Okay.
asking a question.
And
Okay.
Mike, if somebody online has a question, how will I know that?
We will get it to you.
Okay, thank you.
They will do a chat and we'll get it to you.
Okay. Now, I have to tell you that despite I don't have a degree in history. I would have liked to have had one, but you couldn't do anything with it to make a living. So it is my avocation as opposed to my vocation. So you may ask me a bunch of questions that I don't know the answer to, and I don't have any trouble admitting to you I don't know the answer. So don't be afraid to ask something.
Gary's got the first question ready.
I'm going to pass. Okay. Suzanne, take it.
How do you know?
There you go.
Sue Ann.
You covered from 1300 to 1700s. I was just curious in your research whether the churches of those time periods did you come up with, or are you aware of what their thinking was in the church? Did you have pastors that tracked along with the thinking as that history evolved, or were they direct opposite? Just a feel for that if you came across anything.
So the question is, if you were not able to hear it online, is in terms of tracking this history, what was happening in the church at this time? What was the church theologians thinking, and what was the history of the church? There is a parallel study here. We have done an extensive history of the church at our church, and that I think is probably about a 12-week course. There's also a history of the Bible that is far more involved than what we went in today. It's fewer weeks, but the history of the church it really goes back to the time of Moses. But the entire medieval times, the church held Europe together during the Dark Ages. And then about the same time that England was invaded and taken over, then these new thoughts are hitting the church. And as in most bureaucracies, they do not accept new thoughts well. I mean, it's Copernicus was told, well, no, you're wrong, that the whole universe revolves around the earth. And Copernicus was a devout Catholic, and he was persecuted for that, and so the church was wrong because it was not willing to listen and take a look outside its own boundaries. So there's a fascinating discussion there, but we would need to do something and pull even more threads in, and that is something we could certainly do in the future. It's a great question. Yeah, lots was happening in the church because Martin Luther is 1517. We just had the 500th anniversary 2 years ago now, a year and a half, of the nailing of the 95 Theses on the doors at Wittenberg. And Luther was one of the people that spurred the English on to have their own Bible because he was creating it in German and they wanted theirs in English. The common people didn't speak Latin. So,
Thank you.
other questions, thoughts, comments? Tom.
Thanks. I have two questions, actually. The first is a simple one. What's the movie from the 70s that you referred to?
It is Cromwell, and I believe it's Richard Harris plays the role of Cromwell.
Oh, and the name of the movie is
It's
Cromwell.
Cromwell.
Okay.
Excellent movie.
Second question is what evidence do we have, or what causes us to conclude, to believe that the Second Amendment, the founders had in their minds specifically to protect against the king taking their stuff, as opposed to just anyone else?
So, did Michael leave?
No, I'm right here.
Okay. Michael, maybe you would like to take that one on as part of the Institute on the Constitution. Okay. I'm going to let somebody else share some thoughts here.
I have to ask you, just to clarify it again, it's what evidence do we have that
the
this
Second
was-
Amendment was really the issue of protecting yourself against the king, being the right to bear arms. Because that was my conclusion.
Yeah, well, the wording of the Second Amendment actually speaks to that it's necessary. It presumes that a free state needs a militia, and And the militia is not what we commonly think of as the National Guard today, but the militia is talked about in the Constitution in a number of places, and it's the able-bodied citizens of the country. So the idea that the citizenry protects itself against all threats to its liberty, to its and I think it follows from the idea that government is instituted, and our founders talk about this in the Declaration. The purpose of civil government is to protect and secure God-given rights, but it's well known and documented in history that that power, or that authority, or that threat, which will most likely affect the citizenry, is from its own government. That's I think the history of that's borne out by history, that the greatest threat comes from organized government. Bastiat talks about this in the law, where it's what does a citizenry do when those who are given the authority to uphold the law actually become the breakers of the law. So I guess simply put, if in fact we have a theory that you have rights, that would be meaningless without the ability to protect the rights. And again, I think the history's shown the greatest threat to any citizenry's rights is usually from its own government.
So the other thing is that the English, of course, you've heard about the longbow, and it was actually Sunday afternoons were for longbow practice. I mean, it was not unusual for if you were a longbowman, you would actually practice on Sunday afternoons to stay proficient with your weapon. So weapons of the day were available and required of the citizenry to support the king. And then, of course, when you have civil wars, you have people saying, which side are you going to be on? And so you need those means to protect yourself against the other side.
You have a vague feeling that I didn't actually answer you. Get to the point. Was that helpful?
Yeah, no, that's good information. I was just looking for some insight, as to where that amendment originally came from, and you made some good points, and Wayne made some good points too.
Okay.
So I appreciate that.
Okay.
Yes, there we go.
Just to comment on your question here, if you read the Maryland Declaration of Rights in the 30s, it talks about the militia should be by the state, and also it says a standing army is contrary to liberty. So the founders of our state didn't think a standing army should be out there. And if you read George Washington, he hated the militia as a military unit. They did not really fight well. The only ones actually was from our state, and that's why we're called the Old Line State, because the militia here. But the other militia units, he really did not want them in the Army, but he didn't want to stand in the Army because he's seen what it was about, and he wanted the private citizen to be that Army. And if you look into the Dick Act, which is in 1903, creates the National Guard, is where they change all that. And why they change all that is because the Solicitor General ruled in the 1890s that the militia could not be used overseas. And we've gone from being a republic to an empire now, and that's why everything has changed, because in the Spanish-American War, the militia wasn't used. They had to get volunteers. So our whole form of government is no longer a republic. We are an empire because we have a standing army now.
Yeah, the Constitution actually talks about limitations on an army, but not a navy, because you can't build a navy overnight, whereas using the soldiers of the day, they could train an army when required. So traditionally, the U.S. Army was among the smallest in the world because it was expected to be able to draw upon a pool of citizens that could increase its ranks to meet the national need. It's kind of, actually, since World War II is the first time we've had a permanent army. Even between World War I and World War II, it was quite small.
If I could just add an addendum to that, Joe was just talking about the Maryland Constitution. This is actually a 1979 copy of the Maryland Constitution. And Article 27 of the Declaration of Rights, Article 28 says that a well-regulated militia is the proper and natural defense of a free government. And by the way, that language is written before the Second Amendment, so this language was copied from Maryland and other places as well. And the next article says that to follow Joe's point, Article 29 says that standing armies are dangerous to liberty and ought not to be raised or kept up without the consent of the legislature. So just follow
Right.
up on that.
Other questions or thoughts?
You said the Column of Fire was a trilogy.
Yes, The Column of Fire is a trilogy. Ken Follett, his first book was Pillars of the Earth, and that is the story of the building of a cathedral. That story then continues 2 centuries later in, I'll remember it in a moment. It's got wind in it. Has anybody else read them? No, I'll get to it. But Column of Fire is the third one, and it takes place during Elizabeth and James's reign. And what he has done is he has woven into English history fictional characters that represent what was actually happening at the time. Makes it very readable. Another good series, if you want to read about the English Civil War, is Philippa Gregory. She writes a series of 4 books, White Queen, Red Queen, White Princess, and I think the first one is River Princess. And that actually starts out at the time of Joan of Arc and goes through the history of the York and the Lancaster families and what happens to them with Henry Tudor finally winning. It's told from a woman's point of view, so it's got a lot more of the female in it than from a man's point of view, and it's very interesting how she weaves that all together. Sue Ann?
I was just curious regarding while you held a role in the Maryland Republican Central Committee, other than Mr. Perucco, what was the level of constitutional knowledge on the part of the other people?
Well, that's a damaging question. I would say that some of us had a much better understanding than others.
Well done.
Should have been a politician.
I tried. The people said no. You don't know rejection until 18,000 people tell you no. Yes.
Can you think of any country throughout the world? Can you think of any country throughout the world, any country, any single country that does not have a standing army?
That's a great question, because even the small ones, Switzerland would be an interesting example.
They truly don't have one.
Yeah. One of the challenges you have today, I think, is the technology. The early musketry really mimicked lining up in a phalanx, and fighting it out, because the muskets weren't that accurate. Even at the Battle of Waterloo, Wellington really would like to have had a battalion of archers as opposed to musketmen, because they could fire faster and further. But as technology has grown, it now takes as long to build a tank and train people to do it as it does an aircraft carrier and those types of things. And so the Army now relies on equipment as sophisticated as the Navy's, which means that you have to have a permanent presence, because you just can't call people up to serve and those type of things.
Actually, there's a couple forms that I've gone through, and this has been discussed. And one of the easiest ways, you keep it the militia with the states, and you have each state, say Maryland has an armored division, and what you do is the militia, and you could make it, almost like a draft type thing that people have to serve 2 to 4 years. But what happens is each state would take a role of being activated. That's how Switzerland, because they do, when you're 18, you go into the Army there. When you get out, you get to keep your gun. If you're a tank driver, you get to take your tank home with you, and that keeps you proficient. And so you could do it in here, and if you really needed the force you would have is the Navy has the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps would be if there's going to be an invasion, you have the Marine Corps as your first stop to the invasion, and then you would call up the militias from the several states, put them in the active service. But if you had a true militia and not the National Guard, they would be run by the governor of the state and not the federal entity. That's the problem with the National Guard. It is a federal organization. It is not a state organization. So our states have all lost their ability to defend themselves now.
But the states also have a problem in that there's only one building plant for tanks in the United States since they're so sophisticated. And what happens when the states, will they really put enough funding behind the quote-unquote militia or their division, or are they going to give it to their cronies for more social programs? So I think of Washington's concerns with he wasn't getting enough support from the state, he wasn't getting enough support from the Continental Congress. When you do that diversification and disbursement of responsibility, you do not end up with the same product that you need.
And Wayne, if I might, there's evidence, a lot of evidence that our founders and the framers struggled with exactly how this would be carried through. As you mentioned, they provided, the Constitution provides that you can maintain a Navy, but that the Army that standing armies are discouraged, and the Army needs to be appropriated. Congress needs to appropriate every 2 years. So just like you gave that example of every year, I think it was the king had to come back and ask Parliament. Well, that's theoretically the way it's supposed to be in our government, our federal government as well. In addition, it strikes me that they try to strike a balance with respect to the responsibilities of the Army, where when the militia was called up, it would be the rules and regulations and would be federal, if you will, issued by the central government, but the officers would be of the states. The officers of a unit would be their own countrymen, if you will. They wouldn't be serving under a foreign, and what I mean by foreign is somebody from Montana being the officer for somebody from Maryland. So there would be a camaraderie and a local allegiance, if you will.
Well, one of the other things that happened that gives me pause to think about how would that be affected, we had either one or two states' militias had been sent to the Philippines in 1940. And of course they were lost, when the Philippines fell. So there's, some other interesting things there to be worthy of discussion.
Actually, on that one, Wayne, they were actually National Guard units. Now, if they would have been truly militia units,
you're correct.
The state could have said, you know what, we're not going to send those there. Yeah, there was two, or actually I think it was 3 tank battalions from Minnesota, Wisconsin, and California. But yeah, if they wouldn't have, if they would have been truly under the states, the state could have made that determination and maybe not sent them. But yeah, if you look at the calling up of reserve units, most of the reserve units for the 29th Division was from Pennsylvania and Maryland, and that's why 29 is named that. And they were actually landed at D-Day, so they were reservists, called up. So that would have been the militia from Pennsylvania and Maryland, being dispatched there. But the true thing is, and the other thing that they talked about with having a militia meeting of being all the citizens, is when the men of the community are meeting, they can discuss other things and kind of hold the politicians more accountable because they know what's going on. Right now, nobody, like we went for the red flag bill the other night. Not a lot of other people understand what is going on and went to the police to find out. But if, we were always meeting and, what I see it as also has happened is the individual has given up that personal responsibility of self-protection, and they're happy to give that up. That's what's really happening in the country.
So I think it's a good question. How can we engage our community? We're here tonight. Who of our friends are we going to have a discussion with saying, what do you think about this? What are the solutions? Because that's how you get people involved in things, and it starts just one-on-one. You get somebody else involved, they get somebody else involved, and that's how it builds. That's taken me 12 years to be from that side of the podium to this side.
Yeah,
But it doesn't require that much time.
No, it doesn't. And it's longer. We should have invited you earlier, Wayne. I'm sorry. And it sounds to me like next month, you saw the trailer, next month, Commissioner Rothschild from Carroll County is going to make a presentation about his experiences. But it sounds like as we get into the weeds here about the Second Amendment, maybe Joe Delamater has got March, the first Friday, and given us a talk in more in depth about the militia.
That'd be great.
But anyway, let's if somebody want to change the subject to something else.
Actually, I do want.
Sure.
No, not at all.
I'm being yelled at because I'm not in front of the camera, so I'm sorry to the internet people, but I just can't get there.
I'm sorry, I am.
You're when you talked about religion, and what do you get the feel? Because my understanding is they would have called everything except Christianity a false religion. Do you get the feel of that in your research, which you have done?
If you read the words of the Founding Fathers, they clearly were Christians, and they believed that this Constitution works for a Christian nation. And they specifically had concerns about other religions because they were not based on bottom-up rule. English law is bottom-up rule. English church rule is bottom-up rule. One of the things when you ask what's the difference, could the English experience that happened in America, if it had been the Spanish who settled the East Coast, could it have been the same thing? The other kings in the other countries, as well as Catholicism, is all top-down rule. And so it's two very different approaches. And it's worth a discussion, but they lead to different outcomes because what's happening in Central America, South America today versus what's our experience here, and how much did, top-down rule from the government, top-down rule from the church affect that area versus our experience with bottom-up rule.
Anxious for anybody else to hear another voice here. But if you're not, then I'm going to follow up on that point. But anybody wants to cut me off and raise their hand, please do so, okay? Interestingly, Wayne, on that very point, I've had many conversations with people who are in positions of authority in the county and in the country, who have said to me things like, "Well, Michael, that's all very well and good. But is coming, right? That's all very well and good, and I appreciate your idealism and I appreciate your view of things, but I don't happen to believe, or there are those who don't happen to believe in the inerrancy of the Bible, for example, or they don't have the same worldview that you do, and so the implication that they think is, well, that this is all good for some, but if you don't believe in it, then it doesn't matter to you, or it doesn't apply to you. Nothing could be, in my view, farther from the truth, because it's not the, and your history lesson, I think, lends credence to this, Wayne, because it's not determinative what I believe or what you believe. It is the fact that we have a system of law and jurisprudence that's based on a worldview, and it falls apart if the citizenry departs from the worldview. And I think the founders and the framers were aware of that, so that when we talk about separation of church and state, yes, they have different functions. The church has a different function from the state. It's been given a different jurisdiction by God Almighty, but it doesn't mean that it's not still responsible to Himself, to the Creator. So it's not a question of whether you believe it or I believe it. It's the important thing about the study of history, it seems to me, is that we learned that they believed it and created a government based on it, and that government doesn't work without it.
And clearly, the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. It doesn't say anything about restricting religion's influence over government. They expected that how you lived your private life would be reflected in your public life. And I think that's why you have people that collection of individuals that we had together in 1789, where else and what time of history could you get those dynamic, those intelligent, those people who took on responsibility and were willing to live with the consequences, who said, I'm willing to give up my life and all that I own for this principle. And today we just don't have that. We do not have enough of that today. Too often today people take the law to bend it to be like the divine right of kings. Oh, I'm in charge, and the law is whatever I say it is. We had the fire inspector tell our church that. Well, we built things according to the code. I am the code. Well, how do you fight that? Those are tough things. So, it happens right here in Anne Arundel. Well, yeah, with a well-regulated militia. But those are happening right here in Anne Arundel County, where our rights are stepped on, and in many cases we don't even know it because it happened behind the scenes, and people didn't know what happened. But for somebody here's somebody who's not an elected official, they are a hired official, hired person at the bequest of some elected official who believes that they're God. And so I think you go back to the question is, would you like to be in the same position as Charles I and the Parliament? The Parliament said, you are responsible for following the law. This is the law. You are not divine right. It's your position, not your person, that makes you required for this. And because you have not done your due diligence, you have not listened to us, you have disobeyed and broken the law, we are trying you and executing you. The English did this quite often. Admiral Byng was shot because he did not lead his ships into battle against a superior enemy. What happened the next time the English Navy met a superior enemy? They went into action because, if you didn't, you knew what happened to Admiral Byng. So the English have a very strong history of saying you are accountable and responsible. And we as a people are accountable and responsible. And of course, has that deteriorated over 300 years? You betcha. But it was there. And it was there with our founding fathers, too.
I might be going off on a tangent here, but
Tangents are great.
Recently there's been things in the news about these new congressmen. One refused to put her hand on the Bible and take the oath of office. Another one, I think she used a library book or something. And then you got people taking the oath on the Quran. So the question is that legal? I mean, do they have to take it on the Bible or?
No, they don't have to take it. I mean, that was a practice that George Washington started, but when your oath of office, you were swearing to uphold and protect the Constitution of the United States. And it doesn't say anywhere in here that only Christians can serve, only Muslims can serve. But whoever serves, the question is, will you preserve and protect the Constitution of the United States? And that means that you will follow the laws in it. That when you find that you are outside of the law of the Constitution, you will apply the 10th Amendment and say, oh, that is not explicitly given to me as a power and is therefore reserved for the states and the people. That is the one thing that I personally feel we are in most trouble with today, because we just allow government to continue to usurp its power from the people. And as a result, they are outside their boundaries. When you're playing the game and somebody is outside the boundaries, the game is no longer fun. And it's not equitable for all the players.
Just a thought. One reason I think we're in the mess we're in here in the United States is because we've forgotten about our wonderful founding fathers who gave it all, who established this unique form of government and basically gave up everything. Most of them died penniless. They were sought out by the British. And I've asked people to consider this. Here in Maryland, we have 4 signers of the Declaration. I think it would be very proper appropriate to go. We have a field trip some Saturday where we go and visit the graves of those four signers of the Declaration. It's very doable, and have somebody the caliber of Michael Fructa or Alan Keyes speak about each one of those signers. And for those people who are watching online, especially from the original 13 colonies who had a signer of the Declaration, think about doing this in your state or your Commonwealth, whether it be Pennsylvania, New York, Commonwealth, Virginia, or wherever. Because how many people even know who the signers of the Declaration were from their respective states? Anybody who's interested in that idea, talk to me afterwards.
Great idea, thank you. Other questions, tangents, imponderables, off the wall?
I'd like to add one more go back to the Second Amendment real quick. Luke 22:36 is where the idea of our Second Amendment comes from the Bible, where Jesus says, if you don't have a sword, go buy one. You sell your most expensive garment and buy one. So that is where that actually comes from. And the sword is the same sword that it talks about in Romans, which the government is supposed to have to wield the sword. So, it is not I guess you could say unchristian or unbiblical. It is what Jesus has told us to protect ourselves. So,
and since there is a Bible up here, I turn to Romans 13. It says, "Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities." What kind of world did Paul live in? The Roman world was not one of let's elect the emperor. It was despotism. It was complete and utter chaos. Rome was a frightening civilization, and yet Paul is writing, you are subject to the governing authorities, whoever they are and however they got there. For there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. And this, of course, is what leads to the divine right of kings. And then, how do we keep that divine right in check? Because people are not basically good, as we have proven to ourselves over and over again. You only have to click on the news story of the day to find out where people aren't good. And so we have this unique form of government that keeps things in check and has balances and is designed to make sure that if one part becomes onerous, the other part has a responsibility to speak up against it. And then we should be asking ourselves, what have we done to uncouple the pieces that keep it in check? The whole issue of the 17th Amendment, the states no longer have the right to appoint a senator to keep the federal government in check. Those types of things, you start uncoupling the game piece by piece, and pretty soon the game doesn't work.
Wayne, can you give us a little background on how you became an historian? What motivated you to study history, and how we can be better students of history?
Oh gosh, I don't know if I can remember that far
back. Don't go back too
far. Well, one of the things I would say is I was given a love of reading. Some of the most important things we can do is read to our children, read to our grandchildren, participate in a school where we can read to those children. Give people a love of reading. And then I think each of us has different gifts and different strengths and weaknesses. And so what is it that God has blessed you with that you should be working on to share with others? So I love studying history to find out what works and what doesn't. I love playing games, particularly historical games. Can you play a game and come up with a different outcome? That's one of the things I loved to do as a kid. Some fairly sophisticated games. You want to do the Battle of D-Day? Can you win as the Germans? So that is part of it, Mike. There's a lot of, right. I'm a professional model maker of naval ships. Yeah. So there's lots of different things I like about history. But to me, unless we learn what works and what didn't work, we're condemned to repeat it. We can only hope that the Chargers do not look at what they could have done on last game and don't apply it on Sunday. But you can bet both the Ravens and the Chargers are historically looking at what did we do well, right. What did we not do well, what lessons are we learning? And I think that as we learn lessons, we should be applying them. And as we learn lessons, we should be sharing with them. Because each of us has a different viewpoint on things and a different interest. And as we can share those things, we can make the entire community more aware of what's going on.
That's not the Avalon Hill D-Day game, is
It is, and I still have it if
Do
you'd
you
like
really?
to play, Mike.
Anybody know what we're talking about? The Avalon Hill Company, right? They made a Gettysburg game and a D-Day game, and I think Battle of the Bulge
Yep.
game, perhaps.
Yep.
And some others, and that was a lot of part of my youth as well. That was great stuff.
It was, because you looked at history.
Avalon Hill was a Maryland company, by the way. It's no longer in business, but is that right?
Yeah, my best friend took their games and put them electronically. A guy named Jimmy Rhodes.
Are they available? Because that's
I don't know.
that was good stuff.
I don't think it's interesting you asked that, and we're really going off on a tangent now, because we do have people that get together to play games.
Right.
If you want to learn how to be a capitalist, money hoarding, against the people, head of a railroad, you want to play Railroad Tycoon, where you really, learn how to really sock it to the farmer and take everything he's got. So we have, little newer games on that, but other companies have come up with those games. But Mike, that was a big part of, you're reading and you're saying, could I have done something differently?
Right.
And then you try that, and you project yourself in there and say, wow, how difficult this was for this person to actually prevail in that situation.
Right. Well, again, I made that comment earlier on about history being the mall map, and it gives context to the arrow that says you are here, because we are here.
We are
We're
here.
And God, I think the to expand that point a little bit, I believe God put me here now with the talents that I have, and with the resources that I have, and with the comrades that I have, and the commonality of understanding I have with other people, and the opportunities I have. He put me here for a purpose, and I think that's true of each and every one of us.
Yes.
Matter of fact, He put you in this room right now. If you're in this room right now, He put you here, and that was all determined before the foundations of the earth, that you would be here tonight. So I think a lot of times, where I'm going with that is, a lot of times we ask the question about our circumstances. We say, why? Why me, Lord? Or why this, why that? And the proper question really isn't a why, it's what? It's what am I supposed to do? I'm here and you put me here, so what is your will for me here?
And it's a great point. I liken life to a bit like putting a puzzle together. Through each of our findings, each of our experience, we put another piece in it, and it's not until the end we can actually see the entire picture. And how difficult it is to know where to put the next piece, because it's not really revealed to us until that moment. And so a lot of times we look at an empty puzzle board and say, where am I going? As opposed to sitting back and saying, where am I being called?
Right. Where am I supposed to go?
Right.
What's my next move? Yeah. Well, we're not quite at the hour, but perhaps if we could dismiss and have individual conversations, if you will. Wayne, once again, I am very, very grateful to you on behalf of Institute on the Constitution for your presentation. Thank you very, very much. And I thank everybody that's here and that's listening online. Oh, did we have any questions from online? No. No.
And Mike, thank you for creating the Institute on the Constitution. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here tonight having gone through that course.
Well, to God be the glory. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
So let's, Wayne, why don't you stand right there since you've got a microphone, and let
Okay.
me ask people to stand and close us in prayer. And our next First Friday will be I think February 1st, and Richard Rothschild will be here, and that should be fascinating because it'll be real life experiences, just like you heard
That's great.
from Wayne Smith. You're going to close us.
Am I going to close?
Yes.
Oh, I misunderstood. Sorry. Heavenly Father, we are grateful for your presence here tonight. Father, we thank you for your indescribable gifts that you have given us. And Father, I thank you for each person here and online. Lord, we ask that you would give us a clear vision for what we need to do next, Lord. Reveal our next steps, Lord, and give us the courage to take those steps so that we can complete the work that you have created us to complete. Father, we thank you for all that you have blessed us with, and we ask that you would protect us, keep us safe, until we meet again. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
There's some copies of Wayne's presentation on the table here, and if you want one electronically, please let Teresa know. And let me thank the staff. Let me thank the producer, director, and cameraman, and all the staff. Thank you. Okay.